Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Emory Climate Talks. My name is Aurélie Ceinos, and I'm an associate professor of environmental sciences and the director of science policy and community-based research at the Resilience and Sustainability Collaboratory at Emory University. Emory Climate Talks is made possible by our anonymous donor that supports our trip to the United Nations climate change negotiations, and Emory Climate Talks is in partnership with the Department of Environmental Sciences and the Resilience and Sustainability Collaboratory at Emory University. It is very hard to stay positive nowadays, being surrounded with what is going on around us. I am sure many of us are very anxious and deeply concerned about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today is already a 7th day. This war is killing people and is further escalating the climate change problem even more. And just 2 days ago, the Summary for Policymakers edition of the 6th Assessment Report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Working Group 2, came out, highlighting the dire consequences of climate change. The report also made clear that while we need to reduce emissions, we absolutely need to adapt our economies and societies to the urgent threats we are going to face. This report also highlighted the importance of social justice and indigenous knowledge in combating climate change and in achieving sustainable development. What better time can it be for us to have this Emory Climate Talks webinar on climate justice with CARE International? Before we go into today's program, I want to first thank all the people that work behind the scenes to make this Emory Climate Talks possible. I first need to thank Leah Thomas, who does everything from flyers to newsletter to organizing these Zoom meetings. I would also like to thank Kiara Brust, who does the social media posts. For this talk, I also need to thank Carla Roncalli, whom I'm going to introduce later, and Caitlin Shannon, who made everything aligned and for this webinar to be a reality. I obviously would like to thank the speakers, Ms. Aurélie Ceinos and Mr. Carl Deering, to make the time for us to hear their experiences. So let me talk about some logistics before we start. Please use the chat function to address any questions you may have to the speakers at any point during the talk. We will have the time for Q&A at the end after presentation, and I will encourage anybody who is interested in speaking up to raise their hands using raise hand button. You can find that on reactions tab at the bottom. But please mute yourself when it is not your turn and unmute when you are called. Most of the past talks are on the YouTube channel, and you can subscribe at youtube.com/c/Emory Climate Talks. Today's talk will also be available on the website by next week or so. It is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Professor Carla Roncalli, who will introduce our speakers. Professor Roncalli is the program director of the Masters in Development Practice and is also a senior research scientist in the Department of Anthropology at Emory University. Professor Roncalli has such a wealth of experience, having worked with UNICEF in Nepal and Chad, and consulted for various development organizations and international agricultural research centers. Her research focuses on the human dimension of climate change, with a particular emphasis on risk perceptions, communication, and management among African rural communities. I had the privilege to work with her on a small project in Rwanda, and I always learned so much from her wisdom, and I deeply admire her commitment to participatory processes with community members. She has written many articles and is one of the contributing authors of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report that I mentioned earlier. We are able to have this climate talks today thanks to her help in organizing the talk. So thank you so much, Carla, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Aurélie. This is way too generous. Borderline embarrassing. Thank you so much. I'd like to also add that the idea for this talk came up in the context of the CARE Emory Collaborative, which is an initiative that started about 2.5 years ago. Caitlin Shannon here is one of the lead. that had the goal of deepening the collaboration that has existed for many, many years between Emory and CARE, particularly in the area of global health, joining the vast implementation experience that CARE has with the rigorous methodological and technical expertise that Emory faculty have. This particularly is focused on three areas, which I'll briefly mention. One is applied research in the area of implementation science, especially, which, as you all know, is an important focus of research, particularly in the School of Public Health. And just a few weeks ago, there was a webinar, very interesting webinar, that showcased this partnership in the context of two projects, one on water and sanitation and another one on gender empowerment. And that is recorded, and you all, if you're interested, you can see it on the website that I will put in the chat room. Another area is capacity strengthening, where the intent is to cross-fertilize and build capacity, drawing on CARE's staff and Emory faculty. And there again, there have been a number of speaker series and webinars focused on, some focused on topics such as global food systems, and others on sort of methodological approaches such as ethics, of evaluation, evaluation processes, and the role of qualitative research in evaluation. So that is another important resource. And the third area, briefly, is student engagement, providing and coordinating learning opportunities for graduate students, especially from the School of Public Health and the Master in Development Practice, which I direct. They have had a history of placing interns with CARE here at headquarters in the CARE USA, but also in the field. My program in particular has had more than 50 students in the field at different times, at different years, doing summer field practicums, and has been a really meaningful experience and important part of their professional formation. So that's just give you a little bit of the context. And I think this is a great opportunity to really move that collaborative effort beyond global health to other important areas where both CARE and Emory is deeply engaged. I will next introduce our speakers, which we are very grateful for their giving their time today to share their experience and expertise with us. And I'm sure that it will raise a lot of really interesting questions and discussion, particularly in the wake of the launch of the IPCC report on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. Aurélie Ceinos, apologies for the pronunciation, I'm not sure I'm doing it correctly, is Climate Adaptation Specialist with CARE, and is a part of the CARE Justice team. She has extensive experience working on climate adaptation programming in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and has contributed to the design of CARE Climate and Resilience Academy, which I hope she will tell us more about it. She has also contributed to the CARE flagship tool on climate vulnerability and capacity analysis, which is really an interesting tool, and works very closely with CARE teams in the field to integrate climate change consideration into their programming. She's passionate about the interlinkages between gender and climate justice, and about collective action on climate justice issues. Carl Deering has many years of experience in international development and humanitarian work, particularly focused on food security and climate change, which I'm really interested myself in, so I'm really looking forward to his talk. He has also worked in various roles, in technical, managerial, and policy roles in refugee assistance, displacement, and post-conflict crisis management. He is currently the strategic partnership lead for CARE's food and water systems team, and also part of the global gender team for CARE. And has equally a very strong interest and focus on equity and justice in food systems. And I would like to share an important paper that he has co-authored with other really high-profile authors in Nature last year on examining justice in food systems transformation research. So really important topic. And I'll put the PDF in the chat room. So without further ado, welcome Aurélie and Carl. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carla. So I'll start, and thank you, Eri, for sharing the slides. So we are very glad to be here and to be able to share a bit of our experience, and we are really looking forward to the exchange after our presentation. So thank you for welcoming us with you. So you can pass on to the next slide. Thanks. We'll try to cover quickly in, I hope, 20-25 minutes. An overview of CARE's climate justice history and our current strategy. And then we'll try to be a bit more concrete, explaining how we program for climate justice, what our project looks like, and which tools we've been using. And we also cover a little bit how we integrate gender equality into climate justice programming and our key approaches. So it's only 20 minutes, only grasping a little bit of everything, but hopefully it will give you motivation to look for more, and we can go on discussing afterwards. So indeed, I just wanted to start with a few IPCC quotes because it's just released, and I think it's just reaffirming the need for adaptation, which is critical. And I just put two quotes, but the first one is really saying that we need to act more on adaptation and mitigation, and that the window for action is rapidly closing. So I think CARE has been active for a few years. That I'll just show that after, but it's critical that others engage in adaptation and mitigation quickly. So for CARE, we are also trying to convince all others to act more on adaptation, and we are sharing what we have learned in the past 20 years, because we really think that it's crucial and that impacts are already there. So we really need to adapt now. And one thing that also was quite new in IPCC report, or quite strong in this one, is they were highlighting a lot more equity and justice in adaptation, and it's something that CARE has been saying for a while, and others as well. And so it's really glad that it has made it into this new report. So I see Leah has shared the report, the summary in the chat, and I really encourage everybody to look at it. There are a lot of nice graphs, explanations, so it's an easy read. So please do read it, and I'm sure you will be very motivated to act more on adaptation afterwards. We can move on to next slides. A few things that is driving CARE work in terms of context and climate justice. Why we are talking about climate justice in CARE is really because climate change is exacerbating inequalities, and indeed it's inequality between men and women. We'll see that just after, but also between like the richest and the poorest people, and also the global north and global south. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that, for example, like the richest 10% of the population are emitting, or have been emitting, more than 50% of the CO2 equivalent emission. So there is an equity issue behind that, and that's why we are calling on everybody to change, but especially those who have emitted most in terms of country or people. So that's very important to keep in mind, especially that the cost of adaptation will be very high. And so there is a need for support from developed country to developing countries to afford those adaptation needs. The IPCC report is really highlighting that the finance gap is really preventing developing countries to adapt. That's a big barrier now, so we need to overcome that in the next years urgently. We can go on to next slide. And link between climate change and gender equality or gender justice, we could talk about that for hours, I think, but maybe just a few sentences that being a man or a woman is a decisive factor in determining the level of risk from climate change everybody's facing. And why that? Because resources and options that women have to act on climate change are strongly dependent on gender norms. So it could be about women's workload, the limited decision-making power they have, or the unequal access to and control over resources. It will depend a lot in like from different contexts, but it's really important to keep that in mind, because the reality is that generally women are more vulnerable than men, but indeed local like gender analysis are needed to confirm that and to really understand the differences to make good adaptation programming, but to keep in mind. And also that even if women are on the front line to face the impact, they are also on the front line to combat climate change, and they are really driving the action on adaptation, on environmental sustainability and protection, conservation. So really important to give them the space to do so and the means to do so. So that's for the context. And now I'll just move on to next slides on care work. So giving you a bit of background in terms of our history on climate adaptation and our current strategy. Next slide. Yeah. So I'm part of the Climate Justice Center. It's a care global body that is supporting all our country offices to integrate climate change into their programming and strategy. So that's a team of 10 people. And for those who are not very acquainted with care, we are a global confederation with a common vision and mission to defeat poverty and to support dignity. And we are present in a bit more than 100 countries across the world. And gender equality is at the center of our strategy. So we are really trying to look at all our programming from a gender equality and justice perspective. So that means that for our climate justice work, integrating and supporting gender transformative adaptation is really key. And we can move on to next slide. So how we get to discussing climate justice in care. So our first project on climate adaptation is back, was 20 years ago, started 20 years ago in Bangladesh. Most of you, if you have been working on adaptation, you might know that Bangladesh has been driving the efforts of adaptation in the climate negotiation for a while now. So they have very expert people in the country. And yeah, we piloted the first community-based adaptation project there 20 years back. And then in 2006, we started advocating for fair and equitable climate policies. And then little by little, from individual project, then resilience made it in care global program strategy. So it was considered as a cross-cutting issue, but it was resilience, like broad resilience. So for climate-related risk, but also other type of risk, social, technological, etc. And in 2019, we built up the Care, Climate and Resilience Academy to support all country offices to learn more quickly on adaptation and mitigation programming. And in 2020, we were renewing our strategy, and we decided to talk about climate justice. It was central to our strategy, but really to use the word climate justice in our strategy. And climate justice became one of the 6 impact areas that CARE is working on, along gender equality, health rights, food rights, etc. So it's really a big step for CARE, because it means that all our 100 countries need to integrate climate justice in their programming, and it's a big step for us. We can go on to the next slide. So I just put what we mean by climate justice, because there are several definitions out there. But for us, it's a future in which the poorest and most marginalized people have significantly improved their well-being and can enjoy their human rights due to increased resilience, increased equality, and also a limited temperature to limited increase in temperature. And for us, what's key about climate justice is that it requires system change. And so it means that we will do programming, but we will also do a lot of advocacy and system strengthening, and work with other civil society organizations so that they can also be strong and vocal on adaptation. We can go on to the next slide. So our aim is to support 25 million people in the next 10 years to be more resilient. In the last 6-7 years, we supported only 5-6, which is already great, right? But it's a big shift for us. So we are trying to be quite ambitious, because the report, the IPCC report, is saying that 3.3 billion people are living in contexts highly vulnerable. So the 25 million might seem a bit small, but it's really needed. We can go on to the next slide. Yeah, and so you can, there are a few other things to put on the slide that should appear. So we have 3 pathways of change, but basically first one is to work with communities directly to help them to adapt. The second pathway is really working on the enabling environment, so really working with power holders. So it can be at very local level, but also at national, international level, so that laws, policies are changed and can support adaptation and are implemented, because sometimes that's the main problem. And the last one is really working towards strengthen collective voice and action for climate justice, climate action. So working with civil society and social movements to support them in their effort for climate justice. And yeah, and gender transformative climate relevant policy and action is cross-cutting across all those pathways. It will become more concrete when we'll come to the example of project, but that's basically those 3 pathways need to drive all the action of our country offices. And for example, CARE US will have a specific strategy, and they will be working on specific areas such as indeed soil health for climate adaptation, which is a bit more specific, and so it will depend on country offices. We can move on to next slides. And maybe one thing that I really wanted to highlight before handing over to Carl is that for us, we can do adaptation at very different level, but for us, our key strength is locally led adaptation. So we are working with communities and with local actors more globally, so that they can make their choice for adapting. They can understand the risks they are facing and then decide what are the best options to adapt for them. They can, we are supporting them to access finance, etc. So it's very key to us because indeed the risk will be changing. So if we are the only one doing the analysis and choosing the best adaptation option, then maybe we'll help people to adapt now, but it won't work in the future. They need to understand the risk they are facing and pick up what's best for them. So it means that sometimes it's like trying and learning together, but indeed it's more sustainable in the long run. And so we are really trying to combine traditional knowledge with innovative and scientific knowledge, so bringing all that information that might be easier to access for care to the ground, to the local level. And so addressing current vulnerabilities, but also uncertainty and future challenges. And generally, our community-based adaptation, locally led adaptation project includes different components. First one is knowledge about climate change and risk and uncertainty. And then with that knowledge, it helps to build like climate resilience livelihoods, disaster risk reduction strategy, ensuring that local adaptive and organizational capacity are strengthened. And we are also working to address underlying causes of vulnerability. So it could be ecosystem degradation, which is a big, big theme, but also gender inequality that is coming very strongly there, and also other types of inequality issues. So that's for the theory. And now I'm handing over to Carl for the practice.
Well, thank you very much, Aurélie, and thank you, Carla, for the introduction, and Evie for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to take us through some of our programming cases and illustrate just some examples of the practices and the approaches that Aurélie has referred to. So the next slide, please, Evie. I'm going to focus on two particular, let's say, thematic areas. One is climate resilient agriculture. So what we're doing in the agriculture and food security space vis-a-vis climate change. And the second is ecosystem-based adaptation. So referring to the challenges that Aurélie just outlined around biodiversity loss and environmental degradation and the interaction between climate change and climate risk and environmental degradation. So we've got a vast portfolio of agriculture projects, over 600 across the world. Mozambique, India, Ghana, Malawi are some of the countries where we have, I would say, significant programming and bigger projects. So Mozambique, I'll come back to that in a moment, but in India, Ghana and Malawi, for example, we have practices and approaches such as water smart agriculture, or conservation agriculture, applying practices that are quite that are not necessarily new, but so things such as micro irrigation, rainwater harvesting, mulching, intercropping, crop rotation, activities that by implication fix nitrogen in the soil and improve soil health and improve the capacity of the soil to absorb water. So they are, in fact, climate resilient practices and approaches, and we're trying to do this more, as systematically as possible across our agriculture portfolio. But the next slide, Eri, will take us to the CVCA, which is what Aurélie briefly mentioned. Before we do anything, we do this analysis, because we believe that unless we understand not only the vulnerabilities that communities face, but also their capacities to adapt, we're not going anywhere. And I think we've learned over 50, 80 years of development practice that unless a thorough analysis of those vulnerabilities and capacities is done, our results will be suboptimal. The cross-cutting themes that we look at in this analysis, as well as climate risk, are gender, which is central to CARE's objectives, gender equality, ecosystems, and governance, where along the kind of governance spectrum are improvements needed. And the next slide, Eri, illustrates a particular model that we call participatory scenario planning. And this is where we work with multi-stakeholders, right? So communities at the center, but also with the Met offices, for example, and ministries of environment and ministries of agriculture, where we sit with communities together and develop scenario plans based on scientific knowledge of climate change projections, but also traditional knowledge. So again, referring to Aurélie's point about indigenous and traditional knowledge, that's extremely important, not only in terms of its accuracy in some places, but also in terms of behavior and attitudinal change among communities. They have to have confidence in the scenarios that they're building. So this tool allows us to model scenarios, and that increases the capacity of communities to make confident decisions. It's about widening choice and making informed and no regrets decisions. The next slide, please, Harry. This takes us to a case in Mozambique where we've been working with colleagues at the World Wildlife Fund for some years. The top left, you can see a map of the northern seaboard of Mozambique, where it's impacted significantly by climate change. Longer term impacts associated with sea level rise, but also temperature rise, and of course rapid onset events such as increased frequency and intensity of storm surges and offshore climate extremes. And the impact that this is having on the Southwest Indian Ocean seaboard is significant. We've all seen every year, every season, the stories from Madagascar, from Mozambique, of the impact of these extremes. So we've approached this from a governance perspective, but also engaged communities in managing no-take zones. So it was about sustainable management of their fishery resources, but also introduction of mangrove regeneration and protection plans, because mangroves, of course, are a climate change buffer, and they're also an important protector of coastal food security. And then we had farmer field schools, because a lot of these communities, of course, depend not only on fisheries, but on agriculture, small-scale agriculture. And we also introduced savings and loans associations, which are small groups of usually women who are coming together to save and loan and lend together. So if you hit the slide again, Eri, you'll see some of the results of this project. I'm not going to read the detail, but we had significant environmental protection outcomes, also conservation outcomes, dietary diversity, increased fish catches, increased yields in terrestrial agriculture, improved food security, and at the bottom, significant for care would be an increase in wealth among female-headed households. So climate change interventions for care don't have simply climate change results. They are about human welfare, and particularly in the case of our food security portfolio, it's about food and nutrition security. So the next slide, please, Eri, and I can take us to ecosystem-based adaptation. So on the right is a picture from Nepal, where we have worked again with WWF on mountain ecosystem adaptation. In Peru, the same. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And in Uganda, we've worked with the government and local partners on forest governance, and the development of national guidelines for climate smart agriculture, which introduce those practices that are environmentally sound, but also reduce the risk of land use change, or the impacts of land use change, by protecting forests. And Vietnam, you can see the mangrove regeneration going on there as well. But let me go back to Peru. Eri, if you hit the next slide, I can talk a little bit through our glacial program in the high Andes. This is a significant problem. I'm sure all of you are aware of the acceleration of glacial melt in the Andes, and the impact that has on water security, on biodiversity, and of course on livelihoods. So for the last 10 years or so, we've been working on an integrated solution to these challenges. The next slide, Eri, will talk about some of the approaches or the solutions that we've introduced in this adaptation program. So dikes and dams in periglacial lagoons. So these are a newly formed periglacial lagoons, like big lakes that are formed because of glacial melt. But if they are managed properly, you can reduce the risk of flooding and glacial outbreaks, and also they tend to maintain water, and that allows the regeneration of grasslands, which then of course allows the production of alpacas. So there's a big livelihoods dimension or outcome to that approach. And the next slide, Eri, is another solution which is around engaging communities in the protection and restoration of highland wetlands, the palamos. These are basically like mountain bogs where mosses are basically absorbers of water, and the restoration of these wetlands increases water supply and evaporation from increased temperatures. And replanting native species has improved biodiversity, but while also protecting the water resources. And part of this approach is also addressing the humanitarian risk by increasing farmers' capacities around early warning systems, so that if there are glacial outbursts, that there is enough advanced warning. And the next slide, Eri, is more, let's say, political, because all of our approaches, and I think Aurélie mentioned this too, is not simply about a technology or a practice or an approach on a farm or even in a landscape. It's also about politics and governance of climate change. So we engage with scientists and governments to understand and to plan for the impacts of climate change. And this is an important part of our work, and around which we have lots of different partners at global, at regional, and at national levels. I think the next slide, Eri, you can go ahead. There's a list of results on the left here from this program in Peru. I won't go into the detail here, but I will draw attention to the first lesson, the bullet on the top right. We've learned over the years that the effects of climate change are mediated and worsened by existing social and environmental challenges. And I think that's really worth stressing. The climate change community has probably for too long thought about climate change as a risk per se on its own, but it's an amplifier of other risks, and it's a risk that is layered on top of existing environmental, economic, and social inequities, actually. So that's why we try to sequence our interventions based on an understanding of those other risks. The next slide, Eri, I think I'm close to the end, is one that I wanted to flash really quickly because it's a fascinating new program under design, again with WWF. We think that engaging with conservation and environmental partners is very important, because climate change and food security, for example, is only a part of very complex and integrated problems. The next slide will illustrate what this program is. It's under design. Basically, climate change is impacting the health of coral reefs through again, ocean temperature rise and coral bleaching. There are millions and millions of people dependent on coral reef fisheries, not just for their nutrition, but for their livelihoods. So unless these reefs are protected, it's going to have significant food security implications in the next 10 or 20 years. But the good news is that the science tells us that in these countries, if those reefs are protected, they can be they're regeneration reefs. So the biology of these reefs is strong enough for them to be able to regenerate when and if the climate stabilizes. That does assume that ocean temperature rise will come under control in the next 20 or 30 years. So that's under design and would involve engaging with communities in these countries as well. So I think that's it, Eri. There's another slide on partnerships. We engage with a lot of, you could just keep flicking through there because there's a few. Thanks. This is ranges from global networks to alliances, to governments, to science partners, UN family, obviously the convention that Aurélie talked about at the Committee on Food Security, but also regional and national civil society and climate activists. So that's a flavor of what we're doing, and I hope that helps. And back to you, Carla, I guess, and happy to have a chat. Oh, it's back to you, Aurélie, sorry.
Yeah, I still have one slide on gender to share with you, but we don't have time to go into details, but we really wanted to highlight what are the key things we need to think of when integrating gender in our programming. You can go to next slide, please. And there are six things to consider, and we highlighted the need to invest in analysis, and that analysis needs to integrate gender, and it's key. You could have like two analyses or one that is gender sensitive, but you really need to be very careful about that. So that's the first point. And then the second point is to develop a gender responsive theory of change, or having related objective for gender equality in your project, because if you don't do that, then sometimes you just forget that it's a key objective to reach. It might seems to be like obvious, but sometimes you're too focused on adaptation and resilience, and if you don't have gender equality objective, you might miss that and not monitor it, which is the third point. You need to monitor the changes in gender equality. And then to make sure that it's being implemented, you need to plan and budget for gender expertise and to integrate gender training into the life of project, because working on gender equality and gender justice starts with us, right? About like questioning our bias on gender and making sure that we are conscious of them, and we are like, yeah, aware and really motivated to change ourselves before trying to change others. And the last point is the one that I wanted to talk a bit more about. It is make sure you integrate gender responsive and transformative intervention. And in care, we have a gender equality framework that really clearly state that if you want to be transformative, you need to work on three key aspects. The first one being what we call agency, but basically building the capacities of people of all genders. So capacities and knowledge. So it's very like focusing on your own and individual capacities. But then the two other aspects are really important and sometimes forgotten, is like changing power relationship. So, and especially relationship between women and men, but also like power holders and more vulnerable people. So those changing of relation are key for any gender transformative programming. And you need to challenge the system and policies and norms that are in place and that are driving those power relationship. So it won't happen in a day or in months or even sometimes in one project. So it takes time, but sometimes change can happen quickly. And I'll just share one very quick example from Bangladesh. We had a very short climate adaptation project, 2 years, which is not so long, but where during the analysis, we did this daily clock exercise to understand how chores are splitted, what a day looked like for women and men. And based on that, we discussed about what chores can men take up to support their partner to take on, to have more time basically for climate adaptation and for climate resilient agriculture. And in only 2 years, then men take up like up to four hours of additional core work during each week, which is quite a lot in those countries. So but yeah, you need to discuss it, you need to change it, and it can work, and it works. So we have a lot of tools, etc., to do that, and to make sure that's something that is really discussed and chosen by the communities to avoid any gender-based violence due to those important changes. But it can happen, and I'll encourage everybody to look at those tools like CARES one, but there are a lot out there to really work on social norms and power relationship that could be combined with more technical climate adaptation work that is also needed, but can't happen alone. So That's for mainstreaming gender in adaptation. And I think the last slide is only resources. We have a few courses, especially on gender, climate justice and gender justice, the basics of gender, or how gender is integrated in nationally determined contributions. So I'll just share the link of the academy in the chat, but it's like self-paced course, 30 minutes to 1 hour. So, and it will give you a link to more resources if you want to know more. So hopefully it will help you learn on that. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. It was really incredible going from the theory and then the actual practices, and then, you know, we talk a lot about gender, but we really need to discuss gender equality in the climate justice context. And so I'm extremely grateful that you covered such a breadth of issues, and I see that questions are going to come in very soon. But if you are interested in asking questions yourselves, please feel free to use the raise hand button. Again, it is at the bottom. If you click on the reactions tab, you would see the raise hand button, and I will be asking you to unmute if you would like to do that, or if you would like to just ask questions. If you're shy, I'm happy to ask the questions for you in the chat too. So feel free to put your questions in the chat as well. Okay, Beryl has a question. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the amazing slides and everything. I just have one question, and that's like in the very beginning. I think you talked about the climate justice, and then specifically that was like the goal, I guess, is to make sure that the global temperature rise is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because we kind of learn in like our environmental science class that, you know, 1 degree Celsius can already make a very big difference. So I was just wondering, like, how was this number came up? Like, why is it 1.5 degrees Celsius?
Ari, should I respond, or do you want to take more questions? I go ahead while others are putting question.
I think you can go ahead for now, because I don't see others just yet.
Okay, yeah, indeed, Barry, that's an excellent question. Some will say that the 1.5 is like out of reach already, but for us, we do believe that something we can, like by the end of the century, we can still limit. Well, we could limit the temperature to 1.5 increase. So that's why we did that. We choose the 1.5 limit and not the 2 degree limit, because we think that indeed every decimal will count, right? As you said, for some people already the 1.5 limit is like, yeah, is equivalent to loss of territories, to a lot of loss and damage for them. So we know it's not perfect, but at the same time, it would be very difficult to limit it to less. So that's how we came to that. Unfortunately, we would have loved to keep it to 1 or 1.1, but we think that for now it's out of reach. But Carla, you're also on the IPCC board, so please jump in and then correct me.
Okay, Carla, did you want to add, or? Okay, there are, yeah, go ahead.
No, I don't have another, don't necessarily have anything to add, but I do have a question, which I can wait or.
No, go ahead.
So one thing that I was really excited about in your combined presentations is the work that CARE is doing at multiple scales, from the local to the global. In particular, I have seen a lot of emphasis on locally led adaptations and local knowledge, which I myself have been a great proponent of. And the recent IPCC report has made great strides in recognizing there is obviously always the risk of placing too much of the burden of adaptation on those who are most vulnerable and most affected, but least responsible. And in particularly, my question is about how do we connect this sort of recognition of an emphasis on indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices with the fact that indigenous rights are being violated in many countries, in those same countries where we're trying to also engage governments in policy reform. So how do you navigate this space between challenging systems and working within necessarily the political systems that we have to engage for transformative research, transformative action to occur?
Eri, will I try that? Or do you want to take other questions?
So we have 8 minutes left, and then we have quite a few. So if I can ask the others, and then if you could also answer all of them at the same time, maybe that might be best, if that's okay. So one question is about mangroves. There is a question if it's only being deployed internationally, or are they also within the US as well? And there's another, there are two questions about care. If care considers intersectional dimensions of gender in the conceptualization of gender dynamics and power relations. And in your definition of climate justice, I think well-being was mentioned, and there is a question about how well-being is defined. And also Narika is asking if there is a specific demographic more receptive to climate smart techniques. And I know that Candice also has a hand up, so why don't we ask her to ask a question, and then we can have all the answers.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So thanks for a very wonderful presentation. So I think I have two questions. The first question is, I know CARE is a global leader and have a lot of programs. And one of the program I learned is that CARE works to improve the market access by improving the food value chain through like supporting coffee industry and supporting agriculture inputs. But as we know that these activities can, in a way, improve, like, place a risk of climate change. So within CARE, what is the conversation going on, and how do you reconcile these different activities? And the second question is, we know that now urban population is increasing, and now more than the rural population. So a lot of people are no longer smallholder farmers. But it seems like there's a lot of, like, most of the climate justice activities are still around agriculture activities. So in CARE's agenda in the next 5 or 10 years, do you consider thinking about like climate adaptation and improving resilience among the urban poor? So yeah, that's my two questions. Thanks.
Great. Eri, will I go, and maybe Aurélie, you try and pick up what I either miss or might be off track with. But I think they're all fantastic questions. Gosh, we need more time. But let me start. I'm going to roll a couple of questions into one, actually, because I think Carla's question relates to one of the questions around intersectionality, because that's huge. That's absolutely critical. And we do certainly intersectional vulnerability and compound vulnerability, depending on a person's identity, either race, religion, ethnicity, indigeneity, gender, whatever it might be. We look at that as part of the understanding the level of vulnerability and risk that people are facing. I think the issue of rights, Carla, how it relates to, the kind of difficult political spaces that we are in many cases, it's very difficult. But I think what we learned last year from the Food Systems Summit and the food systems kind of transformation narrative that's out there, I think there's great opportunity there, because it is unifying a lot of thought and action around these issues. And I think there's space to be able to engage with power holders, with governments in a more, let's say, neutral space. And it does, at the end of the day, still come back to rights and those rights that are enshrined in international mechanisms, and we have to rely on that, because that's also a space that we have to invoke, but not an easy one, that's for sure. Again, working with WWF, we're learning quite a lot about kind of rights and governance in that sense. Very briefly on climate smart technologies and the receptiveness, I don't think there are necessarily hard and fast rules there. It depends on lots of different factors. So what works in one community, what might work in another. And again, it's a question of getting the analysis right and the understanding. Mangroves, great question. I've never been to Florida, so I don't know if it's being applied on any significant scale in the US, but certainly in the global South, mangrove regeneration and protection is a huge part of the solution, not only because it's a carbon sink and does capture carbon, but because it's coastal protector. And as I said, it also is it protects food and nutrition security. And Marcus and coffee, Candice, great question, because this is very politically sensitive as well, because a lot of value chains are driving particularly land use conversion, land use change. And there is a balance to be sought there. And I think CARE has been working with partners, particularly in West Africa, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, to ensure that environmental degradation and land use change is not increasing because of shifting, the implications that climate change has for production. And again, it comes back to the small scale producers and the vulnerability that they are facing. That's the kind of priority focus, and none of them is producing coffee or tea or cocoa at the scale that is producing emissions that are dangerous. The emissions are from the bigger players and generally the global north, of course. But Aurélie, I'll pass to you because there are lots of other interesting questions you might have.
Yeah, I'll try to complete on the value chain. Maybe one point, I've been working with CARE IT, for example, on coffee value chain, and it's quite difficult when you do that participatory analysis, because most people, they want to keep being involved in coffee, whatever the consequences of climate change might be. So even if during the analysis you're saying that in 10 years you will not be able to grow coffee at that altitude, it's a tough change, right? So we've been trying to integrate those risk analysis in our value chain work, but it takes time, so to be completely honest. And so, yeah, hopefully we'll get there very soon, soon enough to avoid maladaptation, and then just like make sure that people adapt and take the right decision at the right timing, because indeed, when you plant coffee tree, it's like 40 years. It's locked in for 40 years, right? So that's a very important point. I think you missed the question on urban resilience, so I'll just focus on that for the last minute. And it for like CARE main strength is not urban resilience, but we have a few programs, especially in Asia and also Latin America, where indeed there are big cities that are very at risk. So we have some like project, for example, in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, or in Peru, Lima, where we are really working on preparedness, early warning system, also focus-based early action to make sure that indeed people are prepared. And we are trying to adapt also our methodology, because indeed, like what community means in a city and in a rural area is different. So we need to work on that, and we are learning from others that are ahead of CARE on that. So generally, we are partnering with others, so bringing on our 20 years of experience in rural areas with people that are like, I've been working in urban areas for years as well. So it's a learning space, I would say, for us, but it's something that we are very conscious about, and it's part of our work. So I think you covered the other question, and it's like it's the hour, so I'll just stop there.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great discussion, and thank you so much for the questions. For those of you that put in some more questions and I guess, resources. Thank you so much as well. I tried to answer one of them that was not the best, but I wanted to give another round of applause for taking the time with us and sharing great experiences. We're so grateful, and I hope all of you will be back on March 18th. We are going to have Kim Stanley Robinson, who is the author of The Ministry for the Future, among many other books. And I hope all of you will stay safe and healthy, and may peace be with us soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.